She had been cleaning his house for 3 years, scrubbing his floors, pressing his shirts, serving his meals in silence. And on the night he collapsed, the only name written on that sealed envelope beside his body was hers. Not his son's name. Not his lawyer's. Hers. A 26-year-old maid who had arrived at that mansion with nothing but a bus ticket and a grief she was still learning how to carry. And what was inside that envelope would tear one of the wealthiest families in Connecticut apart and force everyone watching to ask one deeply uncomfortable question. What do we truly owe the people who showed up for us when everyone else was only waiting for us to take their final breath? Before we go further, drop your city or country in the comments right now. We read every single one. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Trust us, you don't want to miss what's coming. Her name was Maya Collins. 23 years old, recently arrived in Fairfield County, Connecticut, from a small town in rural Georgia, with exactly $240 to her name. That was the last of what her mother had saved before cancer took her away. Maya's mother, Patricia, had spent over 20 years as a nurse's aide, raising Maya alone, ironing her scrubs the night before every shift, never once calling in sick when she probably should have. She poured everything she had into her daughter, not money, but dignity. How to carry yourself in rooms that don't want you there. How to keep going when the ground falls out. Maya would need all of it. Patricia was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2017. Maya dropped everything, her college classes, her job, a relationship that had been going reasonably well, and went home to take care of her mother. She administered the medications. She handled the insurance paperwork that seemed designed to break even the healthiest person's spirit. She slept in the chair beside her mother's bed for the last 4 months of Patricia's life. Patricia passed away on a Tuesday morning in March 2019, with Maya holding her hand and a window cracked open to let in the smell of the Georgia pines her mother had always loved. 2 weeks later, with no family to lean on and no plan, Maya bought a bus ticket north. She had a single contact, a name her mother's old patient had mentioned once, almost in passing, and the quiet resolve of someone who had already survived the worst thing she could imagine. The placement agency in Bridgeport connected her with the Whitmore family of Greenwich. Harrison Whitmore, 72, had built one of the most successful private real estate companies in the northeastern United States over 4 decades, Whitmore Capital Group, managing over $4 billion in assets at its peak. He had been profiled in Forbes. He had a name that opened doors. He also had 2 adult sons, a daughter-in-law who appeared on society pages with unsettling regularity, and a mansion on 6 acres that took a staff of 4 to maintain. His wife Eleanor had passed away from a stroke 5 years earlier. Harrison had not recovered from that loss. He still kept her reading glasses on the nightstand. He still had her roses tended in the garden even though he never walked out there anymore. Maya was hired as a household assistant, a title that meant everything from laundry to managing delivery schedules. The head housekeeper warned her on day 2, Mr. Whitmore doesn't like to be disturbed. He doesn't like questions. And he doesn't like anyone in his study unless he asks for them. For 3 months, Maya and Harrison exchanged no more than 12 words. She left his breakfast tray outside the study at 7:30. She collected it at 9. She kept the household running with the kind of quiet competence that most people never notice until it disappears. The moment that changed everything was almost nothing. A Thursday evening in late February 2020. Maya was finishing her shift when she noticed his weekly pill organizer sitting full on the hallway console, his evening medication untouched. She stood in that hallway for 30 full seconds, weighing the rules against the reality. Harrison had atrial fibrillation. Missing a dose wasn't a small thing. She knocked softly on the study door. A long pause. Then, "What is it?" She opened the door just enough to hold up the organizer. "Sir, your evening medication. I noticed it hadn't been taken." Another pause. Then, very quietly, "Leave it on the table." She set it down and turned to leave. And then he said, "Thank you." The head housekeeper told her the next morning, with raised eyebrows, that in 2 years Harrison Whitmore had never once said those words to any member of his household staff. Something shifted after that night. Slowly, the way things shift in real life. He began to notice her, to speak to her. Small things first, a comment about the weather, a question about Eleanor's orchids. Then one afternoon in April, he asked her if she played chess. She told him her mother had taught her, though she wasn't very good. He said he wasn't either, which was almost certainly not true, and asked if she'd like a game. She sat down. He beat her in 11 moves. She made him laugh twice in the process. That was the beginning. Over the following months, while the world was locked down and the mansion felt even more isolated than usual, they developed an unlikely friendship. He talked about Eleanor, not performing his grief, but speaking about his best friend with the specific, private tenderness of someone who genuinely misses a person they knew deeply. He talked about the early days of building his company, eating sandwiches with Eleanor in the car on weekend job sites, while he walked her through his plans. He talked about his father, a carpenter from Bridgeport who had been skeptical of real estate until the day he saw his son's name on the side of a building. And he talked about his sons carefully, with a fairness that was itself revealing. He called Grant capable. He called Philip enjoying life. He did not use the words proud, or close, or loving. Maya noticed everything he didn't say. What she didn't know was that Harrison had been quietly, methodically alarmed about financial irregularities inside Whitmore Capital for nearly 2 years. He had built his company by trusting numbers and certain numbers, in restricted accounts only he and Grant could access, had not been adding up. He had hired an outside accounting firm without telling his sons or his board, and he had been receiving sealed reports directly to his study. What those reports told him was destroying something in him that no business loss ever could. Grant Whitmore, his eldest son and COO, had been systematically diverting funds into shell entities he had set up under different names. Forged signatures on transfer authorizations. Manipulated internal records. The auditors estimated between $8 and $12 million moved over 4 years in ways that were unauthorized, undisclosed, and deliberate. It was not a mistake. It was a plan. Harrison carried this alone for months. His health deteriorated visibly. He lost weight. He slept poorly. And Maya, without fully understanding what she was watching, noticed that the man who had once beaten her at chess in 11 moves was taking longer and longer to make decisions at the board, and that some evenings he wasn't looking at the pieces at all. It was Maya who finally asked him. Not because she planned to. It was a Tuesday evening in November 2021, the chessboard between them, a pot of chamomile tea going cold on the side table. The silence had stretched long enough that she felt the weight of it physically. She said, "Mr. Whitmore, whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." He looked at her. Then, slowly, over the next hour, he told her everything. She listened completely, without interrupting, without forming her response while he was still speaking. When he finished, she said, "What do you want to happen? Not what are you going to do? Not what should you do? What do you want?" He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I want it to be right." She said, "Then we figure out how to make it right." She was 25 years old. She had arrived at that house with nothing. And she had just become the only person Harrison Whitmore trusted completely. We want to pause here and ask you something directly. If you had been in Maya's position, young, invisible, with nothing, having built a real friendship with a man the whole world saw as just a wealthy recluse, and he told you a secret that could change everything, what would you have done? Would you have stayed out of it? Walked away and protected yourself? Or would you have done what Maya did and simply stayed? Tell us in the comments. We genuinely want to know. Over the following months, Harrison worked quietly with outside counsel to document everything. Maya's role was not legal. She was not an investigator. What she was, in those months, was simply present. She brought the tea. She sat across the chessboard. She reminded him, on the evenings when the weight seemed to flatten him, that doing the right thing is rarely convenient, but is the only thing that remains solid when everything else has been built on sand. He told her once that she sounded like someone who had seen real loss and come out the other side still standing. She said, "That's exactly right." Grant sensed something was wrong in early spring of 2022. He noticed outside counsel. He noticed unfamiliar accounting requests. He could not find the source. He didn't know about the private attorney or the audit firm. But he had noticed that his father had grown unusually close to the household maid, and he made his suspicions known. He brought Philip down from Palm Beach. Over a dinner that Maya served in practiced silence, Grant made comments about staff members developing inappropriate attachments to elderly employers. His wife Serena suggested the estate's hiring practices needed review. Philip said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Harrison sat at the head of that table perfectly still, listened to all of it, said nothing, walked his sons to the door, shook their hands, and watched them drive away. Then he walked to the kitchen where Maya was finishing the cleanup, sat down at the kitchen table, something he had never done, and said, "I need you to stay." She said, "I'm not going anywhere." 3 weeks later, on a rainy Wednesday evening in May 2022, Harrison Whitmore suffered a cardiac event in his study. Maya found him when the light was still on past 10 p.m., conscious, but gray, breathing shallow. She called 911 without hesitating and stayed on the phone with the dispatcher while talking to Harrison in the same quiet, even voice she had used with her mother in those final months. She told him what she could see through the window, the rain, the driveway lights reflecting on the wet pavement, to keep him present. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. He was taken to Greenwich Hospital and survived. But in the chaos of that night, a sealed envelope fell from his desk to the study floor. It had Maya's name on it in Harrison's handwriting. Grant arrived at the hospital, returned to the mansion that evening, and found it. He opened it. He read what was inside. And he destroyed it because what it contained would have ended everything he had protected. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this interesting story. What Grant did not know was that the letter was never the legal instrument. Harrison had worked with his attorney weeks earlier to execute formal documents, a restated trust, a revised directive, all properly signed, properly witnessed, and legally binding. The letter was personal. The decision was already done. Harrison came home 12 days later, thinner, moving more carefully, but completely clear. He called his attorney. He called his accountant. Then he called Grant. Maya was in the greenhouse tending Eleanor's orchids when Grant arrived. 45 minutes later, his car pulled out too fast over the gravel. She went back to the orchids and waited. Harrison found her an hour later and sat on the small bench Eleanor had kept by the potting table. He said, "It's done." She said, "Are you all right?" He thought about it. Then he said, "I will be." What the document said was this: Harrison had not left Maya money. He had thought carefully about why a direct financial bequest would be contested immediately, would invite every accusation his family was already making, and would spend years in a courtroom rather than doing anything useful in the world. Instead, Harrison had designated Maya Collins as executive director of the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation, the charitable entity controlling a dedicated endowment of approximately $40 million. The foundation had been operating as a formality, managed by a board that met twice a year and distributed grants with a minimum of imagination. Harrison had found this quietly heartbreaking because Eleanor had been a woman of genuine generosity and vision, and what was being done in her name was not that. The designation gave Maya authority over the foundation's grant-making, its staffing, and its direction. It gave her the power to turn a rubber stamp operation into something that actually reflected the woman whose name it carried. Alongside this, Harrison formally referred the audit findings on Grant to the Connecticut Attorney General's office and the SEC, with full documentation. He said to Maya when he told her, "Grant is my son. I love him, and I am going to hold him accountable for what he did." Both of those things are true at the same time. Maya thought of her mother. She said, "Your wife would have respected that." He looked at the orchids for a long moment. Then, yes, she would have. The family's response was what you would expect and worse. Grant's attorneys challenged the trust within days. Serena gave statements to the press about compromised judgment and undue influence. Philip, who had genuinely not known what Grant was doing and was now being asked to reckon with a life partially funded by theft, said very little, and that silence was its own complicated grief. The legal challenges were resolved in Harrison's favor because the documents were properly executed and Harrison gave a clear, precise deposition that left no room for doubt about his mind or his intentions. The Attorney General's investigation moved forward. Grant eventually entered a plea agreement. He stepped away from the company permanently. And Maya Collins walked into the offices of the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation on a Monday morning in September 2023 and sat down at the executive director's desk. The staff watched her with uncertainty. She understood. She had spent 4 years being watched with uncertainty. She met it the way she met everything, patiently, clearly, and with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly why she is in the room. In the first 18 months under her direction, the foundation funded a mobile health clinic serving 4 underserved communities in southwestern Connecticut. It endowed 12 four-year scholarships at the community college in Bridgeport, the same city where Maya had first walked into a placement agency looking for work. It established a caregiver support fund, something Maya had championed from her first board meeting, knowing from the inside of her own history what it costs a family to care for someone they love without any institutional support. Harrison Whitmore passed away peacefully in January 2025, at home in Greenwich, with Philip at his bedside. Eleanor's orchids were in bloom. At the memorial service, Maya sat in the back row, the way she had spent years sitting in the back of rooms, present, paying attention, while the people in the front performed for each other. Afterward, Philip found her outside in the cold. He said, "He talked about you in the last year. He said you were the most genuinely good person he had met since Eleanor." Maya said, "He was one of the best people I ever knew." Philip looked away. He said, "I'm sorry for how he treated you." She said, "I know." And she meant it not as the closing of a door, but as the beginning of something else. Maya still runs the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation. She is 28 years old. She rents the same apartment in Stamford. She drives a 5-year-old Honda. She keeps a photograph of her mother on her desk, Patricia Collins in her nurse's aide scrubs, smiling with the expression of someone who has had a hard day and chosen not to let it win. And on the wall beside the photograph is a note in Harrison Whitmore's handwriting, the one he rewrote from memory after he came home from the hospital and gave to her personally. It says, "Wealth without purpose is just weight. You have always known how to carry the things that matter." We want to ask you one last thing before you go. Have you ever been the person in the background, working faithfully, showing up every day, doing everything right, while the people around you moved past as if you were part of the furniture? If you have, we need you to hear this. Being overlooked is not the same as being unimportant. It never was. Drop a heart in the comments if that has ever been you. And share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, not to make a point, just to let them know that someone sees them. That is the whole thing, really. That is what Maya gave Harrison. That is what Patricia gave Maya. And it is what we can give each other if we choose to. Subscribe if you haven't already. The next story is coming, and it will stay with you just as long as this one did.